Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're discussing not one but two books, Writers and Lovers by Lily King and Early Work by Andrew Martin. Both novels feature young, aspiring writers with storylines that weave together the creative process, romantic relationships, and life choices.
Writers and Lovers made the New York Times list of 100 notable books in 2020, while Early Work was published to largely favourable reviews in 2018. But how do they compare? What did Laura's book club make of them? And which one of us hated one of these novels so much she couldn't make it past 34% on the Kindle? Keep listening to find out. Two books today, read and discussed by your book club for just one meeting. How come you chose two books? And why these two?
Well, we decided to read Early Work first by Andrew Martin. It's quite a slight novel. It's only about 250 or so pages. And we decided to read that partially. I mean, we didn't feel guilty about this, but we were talking about the fact we hadn't read many male authors recently, especially not, male American authors. And Caitlin suggested this book. So she told us what it was about. A young male writer, Peter, trying to write his first novel, trying to write a story, a short story at that. Let's get to that. And I suggested that if anyone was interested, they could also read Writers and Lovers by Lily King, which I had seen lots of people talk about on Instagram, and I had seen in bookshops and so forth. And I knew that it was on a very similar subject, except that the protagonist of that novel is a young woman, and she's struggling to write her first novel. And then book club happened, and everyone had basically read both books. So we had a great discussion, and truly, you couldn't find two better complementary novels. They lent each other a lot, I think.
It adds another dimension to it when you're comparing two very well chosen books. Like, I don't think it would work with just anything.
No.
But with two books like this that are dealing with similar themes but coming from quite different perspectives, I thought it really enriched the whole process of reading them for me, because I wasn't just reading them for themselves. I was reading them and thinking about the other one. And so I just thought, actually, it's an idea for book club. It's a nice one. Maybe we should do more of it.
Yeah, no, it worked incredibly well. Okay, which book did you effectively not read if you only made it to 34%?
And how often do I not read a book? Have I ever not read a book?
Especially not a short book.
Maybe once.
Yeah.
Okay. And I feel bad. I mean, it's not like me, but Early Work. I wonder if I had read them in the other order. I wonder if I had read Early Work first.
Yeah.
I might have been less impatient with it. And so interestingly, because I was primed by Writers and Lovers, and that has such an interesting agenda, not only about being a writer, but being a woman writer and what that means and the obstacles, the barriers that are there, to then read what then seemed like a classic first novel by quite an arrogant male writer. I mean, poor Andrew Martin. The trouble is, I know so little about him. I haven't really even gone as far as to read anything that might rebut my impressions from the book. But I think that's why I had such a reaction against Early Work. But we should tell people about these books individually.
Okay.
And then let's get into the debate.
Okay.
So, Writers and Lovers.
Our protagonist, Casey, has ended up back in Massachusetts after a devastating love affair. Her mother has just died, and she's knocked sideways by grief and loneliness. She is moving between the restaurant where she waitresses for the Harvard elite and a rented shed that she calls home in the back garden of one of her brother's friends. Her one constant is the novel she has been writing for 6 years, but at 31 she's in debt and directionless, and she feels too old to be that way. It's strange not to be the youngest kind of adult anymore. And then one evening she meets Silas. He is kind, handsome, interested. But then he disappears for a few weeks, and she meets Oscar, who walks into her restaurant, his 2 boys in tow. He is older, grieving the loss of his wife, and wrapped up in his own creativity. Suddenly, Casey finds herself at the point of a love triangle, torn between 2 very different relationships that promise 2 very different futures.
I've got a little passage to read that I think illustrates very nicely what I mean about this feminist undercurrent it has that makes this book quite sharp sometimes. And for me, that was very much the pleasure of it. This is a scene. So Oscar is a very successful writer. I saw him as almost like John Irving or someone like that. You know, someone who's like written a great American novel. He's got this one great book that he's written, which is sort of the masterpiece. And then he's now struggling to write his next one. And so this is a reading at a bookshop that she goes to with him. We get to the bookstore a half hour before the reading. Oscar tells the girl at the register his name, and she doesn't recognise it and doesn't know about the reading. She points us to a woman in back, who flushes when she sees Oscar. She says it's an honour to have him, and she takes us to an alcove where there are rows of seats for his reading and a table with stacks of his 3 books on it. 2 people are sitting in the back row already, knitting. The bookstore owner says that the writer Vera Wilde is coming to the reading and to dinner afterwards. I hope that's all right, she says. It will be good to see her. Oh, phew. She said you were old friends. We hosted her at the church last week. She shows us to a room in back, full of boxes of books and a desk covered in paperwork. There are 2 plastic moulded chairs in the middle. You can put your stuff in here and just relax until 7. Can I get you a glass of water? No, I think we'll have a walk, Oscar says, and heads to the door. I thank the woman and catch up with him on the street. He points back to the bookstore. Did you see that pathetic Xerox they taped to the door? Vera Wilde fills the church. I get 6 chairs and a music stand they nicked from high school band practice. Fuck! I'm 47 years old. I was supposed to be reading in auditoriums by now. Did you see the cover of the book review last week? That was my student. My students are blowing by me. I'm not doing this. I always think it will be okay, but it's not okay. I know I have a better book inside me. I have something big inside me. Ever since, fuck. It almost seems like he's going to punch the bricks of the gift shop beside us. Instead, he lays his palms on the wall and lets out some jagged breaths. Nearly every guy I've dated believed they should already be famous, believed that greatness was their destiny, and that they were already behind schedule. An early moment of intimacy often involved a confession of this sort, a childhood vision, teacher's prophecy, a genius IQ. At first, with my boyfriend in college, I believed it, too. Later, I thought I was just choosing delusional men. Now I understand it's how boys are raised to think, how they are lured into adulthood. I've met ambitious women, driven women, but no woman has ever told me that greatness was her destiny. And it's full of little passages like that.
It is. The feminist undercurrent is more of a roaring torrent, but never overbearing, I would say. It's really sharp and enjoyable. There's a certain warmth to it.
It made me wonder whether I was responding to it as a woman. Would a man reading this book like it as much and appreciate it as much? I mean, I really enjoyed these asides. I suppose I've read a few other books about writers, but I haven't read one where this was so thoughtfully articulated throughout in different ways. It keeps coming around, this idea of her needing space and time to write, and how does she carve that out when she has to work and she's got all these debts, and then dropping in this little line about Virginia Woolf's room of one's own. She's got this terrible shed, this kind of basically extension to someone's garage that she lives in. It's all just a nightmare, but she has to have that personal space in order to make this art.
And she does.
Yeah.
You know, and she does make time to write. She's writing every single morning, right? Which, to turn to early work, is in great contrast to our protagonist and anti-hero Peter, who is kind of drifting through life at the side of his very capable medical student girlfriend, Julia. He seems to be living on a trust fund. And then he's also teaching at the local prison. Let me just turn to the description on the jacket, because that is a good summary. Well, a good summary that also immediately picks up on the themes in Lily King's novel, particularly the passage that you just read. For young writers of a certain temperament, if they haven't had such notions beaten out of them by MFA programs and the internet, the delusion persists that great writing must be sought in what W.B. Yeats once called the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. That's where Peter Cunningham has been looking for inspiration for his novel. That is, when he isn't teaching at the local women's prison, walking his dog, getting high, and wondering whether it's time to tie the knot with his college girlfriend, a medical student whose night shifts have become a standing rebuke to his own lack of direction. When Peter meets Leslie, a sexual adventurer taking a break from her fiancé, he gets a glimpse of what he wishes and imagines himself to be, a writer of talent and nerve. Her rag and bone shop may be as squalid as his own, but at least she knows her way around the shelves. Over the course of a Virginia summer, their charged, increasingly intimate friendship opens the door to difficult questions about love and literary ambition. The opening paragraph is very representative of where you're going with this novel. Like most people trying to get by in something like the regular current of American life, I don't act like a total asshole to most people I meet, and am generally regarded as pretty nice, mainly because I leave myself vulnerable to hearing out other people's crises and complaints for longer, on average, than would be merely polite. And the fact is, I do tend to like people in practice, even though I've built an airtight case against them in principle. It's a natural response, I guess, to being raised by relatively kind parents who taught me to be polite and decent and to rely on the company and help of others, but to also consider myself smarter and on some fundamental level more deserving of complete fulfillment than anyone in the world besides maybe my sisters.
Yeah, it's just full of this sort of sense of privilege and self-loathing, and yet at the same time being awfully pleased with himself. And I think it just really grated with me from the get-go. And I think the problem was I felt like the author is saying, here's this character, and yeah, hey, he's got all these flaws, and, you know, look how kind of mixed up he is, but don't you just love him anyway? Isn't he a bit lovable?
I don't think
I was
so.
like, no,
I don't think
he's some.
I don't think the author likes him any more than we do. To be honest, I really don't.
I know that was my problem with it, and maybe that's the difference. If you got on with it better than me, I actually felt like the author liked these characters. And that's what bothered me about it. I felt like he was holding them up, sure, as like terrible human beings, absolutely. But I felt like deep down he sort of liked them anyway.
Wow.
And I was like, no, I don't like them. You're not going to make me like them.
Well, Caitlin opened book club saying, so did everyone hate Peter? And I think it was fair to say there was a resounding yes to that. I mean, he's meant to be detestable, and he really is.
It's interesting. If Peter's meant to be detestable, you're supposed to hate this character. And then that tells you something about humanity or millennials or something, you know, something that you can come away with, like you've learned something. But instead, for me, it was very much a surface level portrait of these people that I just didn't really want to be around.
That's funny. So Phil said, Leslie and Peter are just so loathsome. I didn't want to spend any time at all with them. People did feel that they were realistic characters.
Did they?
Yeah. They did. They did feel like they recognized these people. But as Frances said, there's a reason I don't hang out with these people. They're not in my social circle. I'm steering well clear of these psychopaths.
Oh, that's interesting. May I just say, I feel absolved of not having finished early work because I texted Phil to say, I'm really struggling with this. Do I have to carry on? Is there some great redeeming feature or conclusion? And he sent me back a 3 words and an emoji response. He said, God, no, it's, and then like the little green vomiting symbol.
Yeah.
And I was like, thank God.
I read this interview with Andrew Martin. He was saying that he wanted to be very critical of this male sense of privilege and this idea that you can be a writer and a novelist without actually producing anything. Because that's the key thing about Peter. He never writes. And his girlfriend, Julia, who's a medical student, is also writing an epic poem at the same time. And she'll write for a week straight when she can, and then only come up for her afterwards. And then there's Leslie, this woman who Peter sees in the opening sequence as he's arriving at a party, who he feels an immediate attraction to. She's also writing. She's not just a writer, she is writing and trying to write. Whereas Peter is just kind of getting high and moping about and eventually cheating on Julia with Leslie. But anyway, Andrew Martin was saying that he really wanted to create real women like Julia and Leslie who would feel fully formed in their own rights. And, you know, Leslie's story does definitely not derail Peter's, but it takes over at one point, doesn't it? And we get to go back into her 20s and how she ended up where she is. So I said this to my book club, and Vicky led the charge, but she was like, well, he failed in that front, didn't he? She was like, Leslie's just another manic pixie dream girl and a shadow of a woman.
I mean, I'm just, because I didn't read it. I'm very much on the back foot with being able to say anything, really. And it's naughty of me because I deliberately didn't even read anything about it because I sort of slightly tenaciously wanted to hold on to my dislike, which just came purely from reading it and not knowing anything about it. Because I just thought if I read a load of thoughtful New Yorker articles about how nuanced and insightful this book is, I'm going to have to go back and think, oh, okay, I clearly misjudged it. What did I miss? You know, blah, 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 and spend more time with it. And I just didn't want to do any of that. I just thought it was repellent.
So a few people said it was an enjoyable hate read. Others, like Phil, just thought it was a waste of their time. I was the only person who enjoyed it. I really did.
Did you?
I did. I found it really entertaining. I didn't like them.
What did you like about it? What did you like about it?
I just thought it was quite fast paced.
You enjoyed the fact that you got through it quickly?
I don't know. I was into it. The dialogue was bouncy and obnoxious. And I recommended it to my friend Orla, who has great taste in books. But I said to her, the characters are super despicable. I think you might be into that. And she's like, I do quite like despicable characters. So I'm curious to see what she thinks. I don't feel any sympathy or empathy for Andrew Martin. And at the same time, I feel like this book was his attempt to try and break away from this toxic masculinity and this idea of the great male author, the great American male author. Because, as I say, it is the women who are doing the writing. And in an interview, and in that interview I did read, he was talking about that's his experience, is that there's a lot of men wandering about talking about their writing and what they're doing and, aspiring to greatness. But it's the women who are actually getting down to it and producing the work, which is perhaps a good segue to Writers and Lovers.
Well, just quickly, other elements of it just didn't really work for me. I didn't think the descriptions were very good. I didn't think that the individual characters were particularly well differentiated. They were all very samey. And yeah, so just some sort of basic levels, it just fundamentally didn't work for me. Talking about this idea of, this sort of heroic white male author, there's a funny little bit in Writers and Lovers where our protagonist Casey is at a book signing. This is the first time she meets this established writer, Oscar, and she meets the other third part of the love triangle, Silas, in the books room. And there's a funny little exchange about how he got there really early and there was no one else there, so he had to buy a book because, you would in that situation, if it's just the author sitting there. And then they go into the side room and they're looking at the book and they're talking about the author photo on the back cover. I take the book from Silas's hand. My calves tingle like they do when I'm in a bookstore or stationery shop. Does that happen to you? Maybe not the tingling calves, but, just that feeling when you're in a bookshop.
Of joy?
Excitement. Yeah.
Yes, it does.
It's a beautiful cover, abstract navy blue with ivory streaks of light. The paper is rough, old-fashioned, like heavy typewriter paper. Thunder Road, it's called, by Oscar Colton. I haven't read him. Paco had one of his books, I think, and I didn't much like the writers Paco did. Men who wrote tender, poetic sentences that tried to hide the narcissism and misogyny of their stories. And then she talks about the author photo. He's bearing down on the lens with a menacing look. The contrast between black and white is so extreme. His face looks carved out like an Ansel Adams rock face, and the backlighting has turned his pupils to pinpricks. Why do men always want to look like that in their author photos? My deep thoughts hurt me, Silas says in a scratchy voice. Exactly, or... I try to mimic him. I might have to murder you if you don't read this. He laughs. Whereas with women, I take a book off the shelf by a writer I admire. They have to be pleasing. The photo backs up my argument perfectly. She has a big, apologetic smile on her face. I bounce the photo in front of Silas. Please like me. Even though I'm an award-winning novelist, I really am a nice, unthreatening person. We pull a few more from the bookcase and they all support my gender theory. And so it made me smile when I did flip past a New Yorker article on Andrew Martin, and the photo of him at the top is black and white. He's got his arms crossed. He's looking down, slightly self-consciously. It just made me smile. It was like this kind of classic male author portrait. And then when you look at pictures of Lily King, she's, I'm sure, with much thought and consideration behind it, but nonetheless, she's smiling nicely at the camera. And it made me think of Sally Rooney. And you remember we talked about how you never see a photo of Sally Rooney smiling, ever. To the point now where it slightly irritates me. I'm like, oh, come on, just one photo. But why should a female author smile? Why should they? This book made me appreciate that and think about that now.
I'm not sure if the image you've seen is the same portrait that appears on the back jacket. He has kind of a half smile, almost like he's thinking. And I think he looks quite nice in it, actually. He doesn't look forbidding or shouting. Heroic, no. One of the things I loved about Lily King's novel is how the dialogue is so good.
Yeah, the dialogue's great.
Casey comes across as a very smart, clever, charismatic person, but not because you're being told that she is that way. It's just in little bits of dialogue that you get this sense and you see why people warm to her so much.
Yeah, it's all in the interrelationships. And so she works in this restaurant. And actually, there's a lot of detail about this restaurant, but I didn't mind that. I liked it very much. And one of the things that I thought was brilliant was the interpersonal relationships between this group of people who work at this restaurant, some of whom are nice, some of whom are awful, all these different micro relationships she has with all of these people. And as you say, it all comes through in the dialogue, and it's just brilliantly done. It always felt totally true and real to me.
All of her characters feel incredibly differentiated and real.
Mm. Even if they only get a line or two. There's some dishwasher guy who's there. His whole role is just to go and sit and chat with some diners for a minute, but you get a whole sense of what he's like as a person and his background. There's loads of stuff in just that tiny moment of this one very, very, very minor character. I thought she was great at that.
And I didn't realize until book club, and we were having this discussion, but Writers and Lovers is not a debut novel. This is not a 30-something woman writing, a story about being a writer. This is a experienced writer, now in her 50s. She set it actually in the same time period as when she would have been in her 30s, because that's probably when she would feel confident of what it was like to be that age. But, she's bringing wisdom to bear on a time in her life, a time in this character's life that Andrew Martin doesn't have. He's just a young kid writing about young kids' experiences.
Exactly. And I think that's the point at which it's quite unfair to compare them, and definitely they're just worlds apart. I read also that her mother had died, and clearly there's a lot that's autobiographical in this book, which I really, really liked. I thought that gave it a great kind of sense of truth, but she's not this young, slightly naive character that's represented in this book. If anything, she's the other writer, the little bit I read, the more successful one who sold out the church that Oscar felt threatened by. Mm-hmm. When I read this, I thought, that's you, that's the character. Again, just a side character, like a tiny 2-paragraph bit, this woman that they meet at a dinner. But such a sense you got then of someone who had made writing a career and had been successful, and what that might mean, what you might be like if that was you, kind of thing. I don't know.
And what it might feel like being in your 20s and then 30 and then 31, as Casey now is, and to feel lost because you're not doing anything that society expects you to do. She's still working in a restaurant. She's writing a novel in a little shed, and she's kind of thinking, what's going to change? I loved it when she went for that interview where she was supposed to be formatting a letter. And
she gets this job where she's got this job at the restaurant. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's very unsuitable in lots of ways. Doesn't pay very well. She doesn't have any health insurance. And so she gets offered to interview for this job working for a charity where her job would be to write short thank you notes to people who have donated items for this charity to then redistribute. And as a test, when she goes for the interview, and the woman is almost embarrassed to give it to her, she's like, oh God, this is such a formality. But if you could just go and type me out a response to these people who sent this, what is it, like a cupboard or something? And she goes and sits in the room for 4 hours and can't every word on the card and just trying to type them, does about 28 drafts, finally manages to produce this one terrible note and then just drops it in the basket on the woman's desk and just kind of leaves. And because she knew that working 9 to 5 in a windowless room where her job would be to type these fairly meaningless notes to people would adversely impact her ability to write, which is the thing that she really cared about and knew that she had to do. I love the sense of compulsion in this book. I love the way that it felt like writing was never optional for her.
I think, too, she was trying to undermine our middle-class ideas that working in a restaurant isn't a proper job, because actually Casey finds it incredibly rewarding, and she's working with lots of different types of people. And my husband works in a restaurant, and people do make a career of it. And my book club, those who had worked as a waitress, were saying how real it felt and how rare it is, actually, to read about what it might be like to work in a busy, hectic restaurant on doubles and even just preparing the linen and rolling the cutlery and watering the plants and popping the tea lights out of the candle holders to replace them. All that detail was just fascinating. It's interesting to me that we haven't talked about the romantic relationships a lot, because they're almost, both books I think are sort of marketed on the romantic relationships, and there is a lot of sex, especially in early work, and yet especially in Writers and Lovers, I think it's secondary to Casey's desire to write, and then her grief for her mother, who's died in mysterious circumstances at a young age when she was on holiday.
It's a book about grief, and it's a book about writing. And the rom-com is very much a kind of, it's not tacked on, but as you say, it's not really that important. I don't know about you, but I didn't feel particularly invested in which man ultimately she ended up with. I had a personal preference, but I didn't really mind what she chose, you know.
Yeah, and I even wondered at the end whether we're meant to believe that this will be it for her, or actually it might just be another relationship. But that's okay, right? She's got a lot of other things going on in her life. I found her relationship with Oscar quite devastating. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I found her relationship with his children quite devastating, because they are, what, maybe like 5 and 7 or 6 and 8?
Yeah, and so they're also grieving because Oscar's first wife has died, and not that long ago, sort of 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So they lost their mother very young, and he's coming to terms with that as they are. And so Casey, mourning her own loss, comes into this family who are also experiencing grief. And so that's very important to her. Aside from her feelings about Oscar, there is this family and this relationship with these boys. And I didn't love this book unreservedly. And in fact, I had quite a few problems with it. I don't think I've ever had such mixed feelings of admiration and frustration for a book as I did when I read this. And I read this a while ago. I think I read it around Christmas time. So I read it again this week, wondering if that would change my mind. And you know what? It didn't. I felt exactly the same. And one of the issues I had was that relationship with those children. Not the relationship at all. I loved that. Even though I had some kind of, you know, as a parent of small children, I had some basic childcare issues that I felt she was very much skating over, like how well behaved they were all the time is absolutely one. But yeah, it was the way that when she does then make her choices at the end, the way that the writer didn't in any way address that attachment and that link to that family.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was a real cop-out just to ignore that.
I felt real emotion about that, but I also think that's sort of what life is like, right? You know, you don't get closure on everything.
Yeah, maybe.
And it pained me.
But to have set it up so that those children fell in love with her to that degree,
I know.
and then leave it the way that she left it.
I know.
It felt to me like she shouldn't have done that. And I wouldn't have minded perhaps that. But at that point, I had other frustrations. Can we talk about the ending? Like, not really specifically, but the mood of the ending?
Okay.
Because I don't know about you, but for me, this was utterly spoiled by what I think of as a kind of Nicholas Sparks ending. You know, it has the most ridiculously upbeat, feel-good ending. And I really felt betrayed by that. I felt like it really undermined all the good work she'd done at giving me this character who was kind of living a real life and struggling with real things. And it all felt very grounded and real to me. And then this kind of, I don't want to spoil it. So, I mean, you know, if you're going to read it, you haven't read it, and you want to really just enjoy it, stop listening now. But you know, this sort of fairy tale ending where the book is then a huge success and all her debts, her catastrophic levels of debt, you know, suddenly magicked away. The illnesses and things that she was worrying about are all fine. They were nothing. You know, every single problem that this character had that had been really beautifully set up and explored just vanishes. I was like, what? No, come on. I felt really it was a real shame. And I'm not sure why she did it. I hate to think that she did it because commercially that makes for a much better book. People love a good ending, don't they? That's the ending probably people wanted. But as a work of art, I think I would have just liked it a lot more if, you know, it had been more the reality, which is that most debut novelists, their first books go off and they do just get rejected by every agent in town, and then they have to kind of pick themselves up and write another one or send it to 12 more agents, or, you know, there was none of that. And I felt like it was just too easy and it was a shame. The only thing is, maybe that did happen to Lily King.
Yeah.
Not this book, but her previous book, I think, was the Breakout book, wasn't it? Where I think it was a historical novel. And apparently that did really, really well and sort of like put her on everyone's radar. And maybe that was her experience with that book. I don't know. So I can't criticize it on the grounds that it's totally unrealistic, because clearly there are some writers out there who have this experience. But do you see what I mean?
No, I do.
Did your book club talk about this? Did anyone else mind, or was it just me?
Everyone really enjoyed it, but people were also very conscious that they had read early work first. And so they came to Writers and Lovers utterly primed to have a different story about a female writer, you know, with all the nuance and insight that is lacking from early work. So people were uncertain whether or not they would continue to love it. Like, if they read it a year from now, would it still hold up in the way that it did on first reading it directly after early work? Frances said she just thought it wasn't too labored. Lily King isn't trying as hard as Andrew Martin. She's just an excellent storyteller, and she's telling a great story. It isn't a flashy novel, but it's really well constructed. I think it was Alice who said that in Silas, Casey has found her own manic pixie boy, right? Like, he's lovely, but there isn't much to him at all. You know, they've only really hung out a few times. Oscar is more realized than Silas, which is why I wondered if maybe we aren't supposed to believe that this is it, that this is true love, this is forever. It could just be another romance. What's the name of the guy who sweeps her off her feet at the writing camp? Luke. So
the rat. Luke, the love rat.
Luke is a love rat. But, you know, there is a sense that maybe Silas could be like him. That's why Casey steers away from him in the beginning. I don't know. It's tough, right? Because I always think that books that include romances, full stop, are seen as slightly frivolous. And yet, you know, what is the most important relationship of our life? It often is our romantic relationship with our other half, and the path to finding that could be fraught. It's seen as trivial, and yet it's a very important human experience.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I love the happy ending, you know. I thought, oh, great, lovely fantasy happy ending. But no, it just seemed like a cheap trick, you know?
Yeah, well,
like a writer's trick. But I mean, you know, maybe it's just because I've read so many bleak books these past few months. And, you know, so something that comes along that's actually kind of upbeat and feel good, I just get all, you know, what is this?
What is this about? People finding love. People don't find love.
Don't you manipulate my emotions, Lily King.
I've never met anyone who's been in love and stayed in love. What is this?
No, it's not so much the romantic relationships. I didn't mind that. She has to make a choice and there is an ambivalence there. You don't know whether it's going to work out. No, that was okay. No, it was really the work, the reception of the novel, the wiping out of the college debts, and the job, the absurdly wonderful job at this crazy, amazing school. And I wouldn't have minded, but the rest of the novel felt so real. But yeah, what a great read.
It is a great read. I can't say whether it would be a good standalone book club book. My feeling is it would be, yeah, because there's enough in there to be critical of, as you have just been. But also you get to have big discussions around grief and debt in America, both student debt, but the possibility of healthcare debt and the fear that goes along with that.
And how uncertain it is when you're starting out in life and she doesn't have a family. She's estranged from her father. Her mother has died. I did question. I thought, well, surely the mother would have sold the house and you would have got some money from that. Like, she just seemed to have nothing. But nonetheless, she was very vulnerable and very alone and desperately fighting to stay afloat, really, in lots of ways.
Yeah, so it was a really fantastic portrait of a young woman.
And actually, mental health. There is a sort of slide, isn't there, into a kind of anxiety-induced nadir. You know, there's a sort of moment where she's really having a breakdown. And I thought that was really beautifully written. It seemed real to me and well described how she might have been feeling and the help she needed to get her past that.
Whereas then you have Peter in Early Work, who someone in my book club said was basically Luke, the love rat from the writing camp. That's basically Peter in maybe like 10, 15 years, just feeling utterly sorry for himself and sweeping this woman off her feet and then casting her aside. I think Early Work is a great book club book because it's so obnoxious. But maybe, I don't even know if my book club would agree with me. Maybe better just to stick with Writers and Lovers alone, or you could add Early Work into the mix, but don't do it by itself.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Inspired by Writers and Lovers and Early Work, here are some more recommendations for your next book club book.
My favourite novel featuring a writer, which I had at the back of my mind reading this, is The Wonder Boys by Michael Chabon. Have you ever read it? Or seen the film? Made into a really good film with Robert Downey Jr. and Michael Douglas playing the writer, Grady Tripp. You haven't seen it?
Nope.
Really good book. And a great film, actually. Very unusual, but a really good film of a really good book. Grady Tripp is an oversexed, pot-bellied, pot-smoking, aging wunderkind of a novelist, now teaching creative writing at Pittsburgh College, while working on his 2,000-page masterpiece, Wonder Boys. When his rumbustious editor and friend, Terry Crabtree, arrives in town, a chaotic weekend follows, involving a tuba, a dead dog, Marilyn Monroe's ermine-lined jacket, and a squashed boa constrictor. It's been many a year since I've read it. I actually had a copy on the shelf just above my computer here, which I pulled down. I think it was it Chabon's first novel? There's this thing about the kind of successful male writer, the genius male writer, but he does kind of poke fun at that, this idea he can't finish this book, and the lengths that he's going to try to get it done leads to this farcical comic caper that also has all these really nice insights into what being a writer is like and the publishing process. And there are other characters in this book who come along who turn out to be really good, and their stuff gets snapped up by his agent, while his own book, he keeps trying to get it done and not getting anywhere. I really loved it. Kind of made me want to read it again, actually. But the book I really wanted to recommend, because it doesn't feel like a book about male writers, this is about female writers, and I wanted to recommend a book called The Possessed by Elif Batuman, which is non-fiction, but she actually then went on to write a novel that followed on from this. But the book that I want to recommend is her story of travelling around Russia, following in the footsteps of her favourite authors, and she's searching for the answers to the big questions. She investigates a possible murder at Tolstoy's ancestral estate, travels to Samarkand and St. Petersburg, retraces Pushkin's wanderings in the Caucasus, learns why old Uzbek has 100 different words for crying, and sees an 18th century ice palace reconstructed on the Neva. Combining fresh rereadings of the great Russians from Gogol to Goncharov with the sad and funny stories of the lives they continue to influence, The Possessed introduces a brilliant and distinctive new voice, comic, humane, charming, poignant, and completely and unpretentiously full of an infectious love for literature. I love this. It's so funny and brilliantly written from someone who's very much an insider in this kind of literary world, you know, the sort of Harvard grad or Yale, I can't remember where she went. It's very much written from that point of view, and that's really enjoyable to be in her company, even though I knew as a reader that I could never approach anything like her intellectual level. But it's just such a fun ride. And then she wrote a novel called The Idiot, which lots of people loved. And I enjoyed it. But the thing is, because I'd read The Possessed, and I felt like a lot of the material that's in the novel, The Idiot, came from her own experiences that she writes about so brilliantly in The Possessed. For me, the novel didn't quite work. It didn't work as well because I just didn't think it was as good, actually, even though the writing is fine and it was an enjoyable read. But so my real pick is The Possessed. But I also recommend her novel, The Idiot, which follows similar lines, except that the main character is a linguistics and literature student. And one of the running themes in that is about investigating language and semiotics and the meanings of words. And yeah, so actually three books.
I should say I love The Idiot. I think it is.
Did you?
Yeah, I think it is flawed. Like it really peters out towards the end. But Elif Batuman, I want to be friends with Elif Batuman. She is so funny.
Yeah.
And
she's great.
And her main character in The Idiot is so endearing and recognizable. And that is tough because these books are about young people finding themselves. And, you know, it's not so long ago that I was young and finding myself. And so, you know, when you actually recognize it, when it doesn't just feel like a superficial portrait of what it's like to be young in your 20s, it strikes home. And I think Elif Batuman does that in The Idiot.
Yeah.
I'm going to recommend two books that possibly don't do it as well, but I think would both make for good book club books, especially zippy, fast-paced ones, both by young Irish female writers. The first one everyone will have heard of. It's Sally Rooney's debut, Conversations with Friends, which is great. I loved that book, and I think it's worth all the attention that it gets. Many of you will be familiar with the plot. Our protagonist is a writer. She's young. She's in university or just finished, perhaps. And she embarks on a love affair with a married man. And usually I'd find that quite problematic, but actually it's more interesting in this book than I think it would normally be. At the same time, she has this very charged relationship with her best friend, and that becomes a romantic relationship too. It's a great book. I think it has a great ending. I think some people find it really frustrating, but actually I think Sally Rooney doesn't do what Lily King does. She leaves it open-ended. She doesn't give you a happy ending. She doesn't give you a sad ending, but you know, it's ambiguous. The other book I want to recommend, which won't be on most people's radar, is Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan, which is a great read, really enjoyable. I read it this past spring, and actually I think we talked about it on Bookshelf. It is about a young woman. She's not a writer, although she is very interested in language. She is an expat in Hong Kong. She's only 21, and she's teaching English grammar to a bunch of wealthy young children. She also meets Julian, who's a bit older than her. I think he's 28. He's an old Etonian, the most upper-class privileged school in the UK, and they start sleeping together. And very quickly she moves in with him because why not? He has a beautiful flat. She's been living in a tiny little bedsit practically with roommates. But then when Julian's away on business, she falls in love with Edith, who is a wealthy Hong Kong-born lawyer. And again, another emotional triangle. What I loved about this book is how sharp it is. It is a debut novel, so it doesn't have the maturity of Lily King's insight. But Naoise Dolan is very cutting. I think she's been compared to Dorothy Parker. There is some truth to that. The Irish Times said the novel is likely to fill the Sally Rooney-shaped hole in many readers' lives. So for that reason alone, you guys might want to be rushing to read it. It touches on class, capitalism, queerness, power, and the unfathomability of social mores. That's not me. That's the LA Times. A great book, nice to read. And I think the characters are on the verge of being as despicable as Andrew Martin's, but they have a few more redeeming features.
I keep meaning to read that one. Can I just do one more really quickly? You will be familiar with it because I've talked about it on the podcast before. It's called Bleaker House by Nell Stevens.
Of course.
It's a mixture of memoir and fiction, in that it's a memoir, but it has fictional stories in it. She's studying creative writing, and she gets this fellowship that allows her to go anywhere in the world for 3 months in order to write. And she decides to choose this island called Bleaker Island, which is off the Falklands, and she goes there, and she's the only person in this little guest house. She thinks that solitude and isolation are going to be the way to find that kind of creative force that she knows is sort of tucked away inside her and really help her focus on her work. And she gets there and it's just cold and miserable. The weather is awful and just sort of depressing, and she doesn't have enough to eat because the only food she's got is stuff that she was able to take there in a suitcase. And so she's kind of eking out. She's got these Ferrero Rocher that she took, and just the pleasure that she gets from like half a Ferrero Rocher, which is like all she's kind of rationed herself to get her through it. She actually is pretty unhappy. And interspersed with this sort of story are these little short stories that interlink that she's writing. And it was a great, I thought, exploration of the creative process, of what it means to be a writer, what it means to be a young woman writer, and then this nice fiction interwoven through it. And it was just really well written. I remember it was just, for me, a very unexpected delight. I didn't know anything about it. I picked it up because I loved the cover. And I loved that book. It was so great. She's gone on to write another brilliant book called Mrs. Gaskell and Me, which is about the writer Elizabeth Gaskell, which I also recommend she's just such a good writer. But it was really funny having read this and almost like her starting out to be sort of following her career now. I'm really interested in everything she writes because I'm like, oh, right, this is what she's up to now. And I mean, she just seems to be getting better and better to me. I
remember you speaking about both books, and I've always meant to pick them up. I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but those sound great. And actually, I probably would read them. Well, I definitely would read them if they're book club books. So maybe that's the way to get them into my TBR pile.
Yeah, super good for book club, both of them.
Finally, we have a recommendation from our favorite podcast friend and member of my book club, Phil, who brought up a title called Rainbow Milk during my discussion. So we asked him to tell us more.
I actually brought up Rainbow Milk, which is the debut 2020 novel from Paul Mendez, because it shares this amazing set piece with early work. I guess they both have these fantastic scenes where the protagonists are waiters in restaurants, and just following how exhausting that can be and running back and forth through all these demanding customers and tables. On top of that, it sort of fits in thematically with these books. It follows the trials and tribulations of a young 20-something writer, and it also veers into autofiction. I'm not a huge fan in any of these genres, but Rainbow Milk has a lot of other stuff. It begins with the protagonist's grandparents in Jamaica and follows them. They're part of this Windwest generation that emigrates to the UK in the 50s and 60s. And then it follows the protagonist's upbringing up north in this place called Tipton, between Wolverhampton and Birmingham, in a very conservative Jehovah's Witness family. And the protagonist is gay. He's coming to terms with that and sort of getting ejected from the family, coming to London in the aughts, and then getting on his feet. That's the basic outline of the novel. There's a lot of fantastic writing there, including this set piece. There's another great set piece sort of much later on where he's negotiating this relationship with a much older intellectual gay man. I don't know to what extent that's modeled after Mendez's own relationship. His boyfriend is Alan Hollinghurst. But I do recommend this book. I think there's a lot of meat in it. I don't think it's a perfect novel or anything, but I do think Mendez is certainly a novelist to watch.
That's nearly it for this episode, but first, a quick recap of the books we mentioned, which were The Wonder Boys by Michael Chabon, The Possessed and the Idiot by Elif Batuman, Bleaker House by Nell Stevens, Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney, Exciting Times by Naoise Dolan, and Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendez. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a bookshelf show in which we'll cover all the things we've been reading for ourselves recently. Listen in to hear our recommendations, plus any great new book club reads we've come across.
In the meantime, don't miss our most recent interview with To Your Books podcaster Simon Thomas. Before the internet, you may remember people used to send letters to friends abroad in the post. Well, Simon came up with the wonderfully romantic idea of posting a book, with attached notepad for comments from friend to friend around the world, eventually receiving back the book with comments from every reader along the way. In times of COVID lockdown, could this be the perfect form of book club? Listen in to episode 86 for all the details, plus some great book recommendations.
Enjoyed the show? Want to listen to more? You'll find our archive of over 80 episodes at thebookclubreview.co.uk. From our discussion of the blockbusting bestseller Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens, to life-changing nonfiction like Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. You can also explore our ever-growing library of book reviews and articles, all designed to help you figure out your next read, whether for yourself or for your book club.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at BookClubRVWPod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com.
And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please take a moment to rate and review the show, as this helps us to reach new listeners. And if you have a bookish friend who might like the show, then do send them the link.
But for now, that's our show. Thanks for listening and happy reading.